All right, guys, welcome back. AP Environmental. Today's topic is Unit 2. It's topic 2.7, which is the last of the topics in Unit 2. And it's on something called community succession. This is kind of a short one. This won't take me too long, so just kind of bear with me till the end of this. But it's a pretty important topic. In the previous topic, 2.5, and if you're wondering about 2.6, I actually taught you 2.6 when I taught you 2.1. So I kind of combined those two topics together. So if you're kind of wondering why I went from 2.5 to 2.7, it's because I already covered 2.6. But anyway, in 2.5, one of the big things we talked about was disturbances, like either natural or anthropogenic, and and they have a toll that they take on an ecosystem. So today we're going to talk about how ecosystems recover, kind of naturally from those disturbances. So the definition here for succession, it says it's a predictable, that's kind of a key word there, predictable, replacement of one group of species by another over time. And whenever we talk about succession, I kind of want to make sure that we understand that there's two different types. And these two, I'm gonna talk about each one of them in my video, but I also highly suggest that you watch the AP Daily videos. I think she does a pretty good job of talking about these two things as well. So if you want to hear about the same topic just from a different voice, sometimes it's really helpful to watch those AP daily videos. So let's start off with primary succession. Now, a really good example of this is an abandoned parking lot. So essentially, what we're doing here is we're building a community from scratch. There's nothing living here. It's just barren rock basically. It's asphalt or concrete or whatever, but it's lifeless. There's no soil here. So you would think that how could a community of organisms eventually take over an area like this? But it does happen. It takes a lot of time, obviously. It doesn't happen overnight. But during primary succession, we're always starting with an area like this, where we just have absolutely nothing, no life whatsoever, no soil. It's just barren rock. Now, over time, eventually what happens is we get a kind of a sequence of steps, kind of organisms that start to occupy this area. And it always starts with something very basic, something very simple. It starts with some of the most basic plant life that we have. This picture here, what you're seeing is like some cracks in the concrete, for example. And you see these little green organisms here. These are called lichens, or mosses. Maybe you've heard of mosses before. But these are basically plants that don't really grow tall. I mean, they're kind of spreading type of plants, and they grow perfectly in the little cracks of concrete or rock or things like that might have some water that seeps into there, and they can use that as a resource. But these plants are very successful. They're the first organisms to really take over an area. And then eventually, years later, you might get some bigger plants that kind of move in. So here might be another stage of our succession. And then eventually we get, some bigger plants that might move in after that. And eventually, who knows, you might get a scene like this where you get some bushes and some tall trees and things like that that might move in. So what you're seeing here is kind of a sequence of steps in how you can have almost like basically nothing, like a barren parking lot, but eventually over long periods of time, you might get this type of succession that rolls in. It's called primary succession. Now, to kind of take you through the steps here, I think this is a really good picture. Again, primary succession always starts with just barren rock. So you'll notice here on the left, this is kind of our first stage of primary succession. Then you'll notice this gray arrow here. This is time. And this is, in some cases, hundreds of years of time, for all of this to eventually make its way towards the end. So we'll kind of walk through this together real quick. So primary succession, again, it begins with with this exposed rock. Now, one thing about this rock is this is kind of the basis of soil. Soil is basically crushed rock. That's what it basically is. So how do we go from this exposed rock to eventually getting soil? Well, that's where the lichens and mosses come in. These first plant species, what they basically do is they live on the rock or within the cracks of the rock, and they actually excrete acids. And what those acids do is they actually break the rock down, and it actually helps the plant to absorb nutrients from the rock. So this is actually a really critical step that these lichens and mosses do what they do, because not only are they using the rock for nutrients, but they're also kind of forming the soil. When they're breaking that rock down, they're forming that soil. So this is kind of a critical stage of primary succession. And then we get something called mid-successional plants. We get some weeds that come in and maybe some grasses and things like that. They kind of take over after the lichens and mosses. These are plants that are very well adapted to grow where there's lots of sunlight. Probably not a lot of nutrients in the soil yet because there's not a lot of plant life that's been growing there previously. But these are kind of our mid-successional plants. Then we get into what we call our pioneer species. The pioneer species is the first tree species that occupies the area. One thing about the pioneer species is they're usually a little bit smaller trees, but they're very tolerant of lots and lots of sun. So, I mean, these are trees that are going to be able to grow where there's, again, a lot of sun. There's not a lot of shade there for them. All right, so they can grow pretty well there. Those are called pioneers. Aspens, cherries, young pine trees are really good examples of those. And then eventually we get our shade trees. Now, these are trees that not only do they don't call them shade trees because they produce a lot of shade. They call them shade trees because they can grow in the shade of all of these other trees. For example, when this big, let's say this maple tree here, is a little sapling, it's a little tiny baby tree, it's growing in the shade of all of these pioneers. So we call them shade trees because, yeah, they do provide a lot of shade eventually when they get big enough, but they grow very well in shade of other trees. So we call them shade trees for that reason. But eventually they'll come in. They're kind of the last species of tree that will occupy the area. But again, this takes hundreds of years of time in order to get to this point. Now, imagine if there's some type of disruption to this, whether it be a forest fire or, again, like a timber company comes in and removes a bunch of these trees. Well, then we're kind of removing certain stages of the primary succession. Well, this is what we call secondary succession. Secondary succession happens basically after there's some type of a disruption. And you'll notice really kind of the big difference between this picture and this one is, if there is a disruption, we're not necessarily going all the way back to exposed rock. I mean, you might get a forest fire that burns down all the trees, for example. Let's say just all the trees are dead, okay? Or a timber company comes in and removes all them. So, well, I mean, if you remove all the timber, I mean, you still have all the weeds and the lichens and the soil that was established before. So you'll notice here that we're not starting with bare rock. We're not going all the way back to step one. We're kind of starting sort of in that mid-successional range. So secondary succession will happen a lot quicker compared to primary succession, because in primary succession, we had to first establish the soil, and then the mid-successional plants would come in, and then the pioneers, etc. Whereas in secondary succession, that soil is already established there. So the mid-successional plants can be very successful very quickly, then eventually the pioneers and the shade trees can eventually move in. So I do want you to understand that secondary succession happens after some type of a disturbance, but the community can recover fairly quickly from that compared to primary succession. All right, last thing here. This is a slide that was shown, or that is being shown, in one of the AP Daily videos, and I really like this. I want to make sure we understand this, because this is kind of where we have to, again, kind of interpret data and kind of understand what the data tells us. So it says your scientists calculated the net primary productivity and species richness of two different ecosystems, and the results are summarized below. So ecosystem A, the NPP, remember that number is an indicator to us that we have a very well, I'm going to say biodiverse, but there's a lot of plant life, right? The higher the number, the more photosynthesis there is, the more carbon there is, plant-based carbon in that particular area. So, when this number is high, compared to another community, that tells us a little bit about plant life that's there. It's a lot more abundant than, let's say, another community. So anyway, the NPP is 1,650. The plant richness, remember that's how many species of trees there are, it's 15. The animal richness, how many species of animals there are, is 23. Now you compare that to ecosystem B, where the NPP is much lower, so that should indicate to us something about the abundance of plant life. The plant richness is much lower, so there's less species, and animal richness is much lower as well. So it says, what can you conclude about the level of disturbance in each ecosystem? And they want you to explain that. This might be a really good AP question that you might see on an exam. So what we probably can conclude about this is ecosystem B most likely is or has experienced a more recent disturbance. This is most likely kind of in the early stages of primary succession, like maybe like the pioneer species have moved in, but it hasn't quite been totally established yet, or maybe this is in some stages of secondary succession. Whereas ecosystem A is much further established. There hasn't been a disturbance to this ecosystem for maybe a very long time. Now, if something did happen to ecosystem A, then think about what would happen to the net primary productivity. It would go down. The plant speed or the plant richness would go down. Of course, the animal richness would go down as well. So we can probably conclude from these two ecosystems that ecosystem B again has experienced a much more recent disturbance than ecosystem A has. Okay. All right, that's it for me today, guys. Hopefully we understood this fairly well. Make sure you look over those slides and look over your notes on this. There will be quite a few questions on your quiz about primary and secondary succession. All right, have a good day, everybody.